And I think my talk will differ from Kirsten's in a number of ways. Okay, I need to make sure that you can all hear me. So my talk will differ from Kirsten's in a number of ways. So where Kirsten looked really at the interplay between different types of media, there is a monoculture here. We're looking at one particular type of media. Most of the time we look at propaganda posters. And then also I have tried to pack the main argument of this paper into 8 theses, which I will then illustrate with the help of some examples really. And I have basically 2 research questions here that I've brought to the material. One is a question that has been asked by a number of scholars, so that's not entirely new. There's a critique of what's out there, but the question of how Africans are represented, or Africans or interchangeable with blacks, how they've been represented in Chinese visual propaganda. There is already some literature out there, but in keeping with the broader concerns that we have in mind for this project, I'm also addressing the second question, namely how Chinese visual propaganda reflected the Sino-Soviet rivalry in Africa. And I want to start with a methodological caveat. And the caveat is that it is actually very difficult to make generalizing assumptions or draw generalizing conclusions about Chinese propaganda posters. They're really a source that has generated in the last 10, 20 years or so a huge interest. But what we don't have is we don't have a complete overview of how many posters are out there. And it's nicely illustrated by 2 book chapters by Stefan Landsberger, is a German teaching in the Netherlands. And he's one of the outstanding both collectors and interpreters of these posters. You'll see some posters are from the Landsberger collection, which is online. And in 2014, he published an article where he brought up a lot of questions surrounding the amount of production and the reception of those posters. And then in 2021, he answered tentatively some of those questions he'd asked 7 years earlier. And but still, I think we're not anywhere at a conclusive answer. So his estimates for the output of individual publishing houses, there were individual publishing houses producing those posters in the 1950s to the early 1960s, suggest a print run of 3 to 4 million copies per publisher in normal years, and several times that in periods of especially intense political mobilization. And he estimates there were upwards of 100 poster designs per year. So we can't really see the head and the tail of it, right? So this is the caveat that I need to make when I talk about, or when I try to draw generalizing conclusions about how Africans and Sino-Soviet rivalry are depicted in those posters. We also know that some of those posters were shipped abroad. And again, that is a field that is just, being scrutinized as we speak. I have an MA thesis at UCL that looks at these things. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to engage with it to the extent that I would like to, but I will get there at one point. But that's also something to bear in mind. My starting point, which I will illustrate subsequently in one of my theses, is that indeed those posters, even though they were exported, were primarily speaking to Chinese audiences. So they were not even, I think, primarily speaking to Africans. They were primarily speaking to a Chinese audience, and basically keeping a public that was, of course, especially when the communists took power in 1949, largely illiterate, were giving them a means to engage with these kind of questions of what Africans were like, but also what China was doing in Africa. And so let me then begin with the first thesis, which is that Chinese propaganda posters rarely show an interest in Africa and Africans per se, but embed their representation within larger political concerns. So in other words, images of Africans alone are actually a minority of what I have seen. They exist, but they are a minority. And to illustrate this, let us look at some of the typical productions. There is a lot of things I could say about this poster, but let's just look at this triad of a European figure standing in the center, an Asian figure on the right, and an African figure on the left. And to preempt Rakesh's question, or to link up with Rakesh's question, yes, Africans are Black. And this, I will come back to that point later. And the P stuff at the back, will come to that later. But this is a triad that dominates very much the 1950s. By the early 1960s, it's been replaced with a slightly different triad, because the European figure has now been replaced by, you know, this, I don't know, I always have associations of Fidel Castro, with this purportedly Latin American figure. And that is very much in line with also the verbal propaganda, which often refers to the anti-imperial struggles of Ya Fe La, so Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this is no coincidence that we have a different triad of peoples there. I would like to point to the African. We have seen a similar image actually in Kirsten's talk. The African has just kind of freed himself of his shackles. And that is also, that's a motive that occurs occasionally in a variety of contexts.
Same one with Russian titles.
Right home, yeah. Okay, so which brings me to the second thesis. Chinese propaganda posters create the African as an ideal type. And ideal type is a term that I've appropriated from Harriet Evans at Westminster University. She's one of the main interpreters of these propaganda posters. So as an ideal type, oscillating between tradition and modernity, and thus suitable for shifting political contexts. And so, well, again, allow me to illustrate that. We will see this poster actually twice, but here I'm really interested in one of the markers of the African stereotype, which is through clothing. And this poster is particularly interesting because it actually shows a variety of dresses in which the Africans are imagined. So we have the more kind of, I don't know if I can operate my cursor, I probably can't. So you've got the figure on the left, but also the African woman kneeling in front of the tractor, the one on the right-hand side of the tractor. This is often, you know, the kind of the traditional, this kind of flowing garb, these opulent headgears, how Chinese propaganda artists imagine Africans to be. So this very kind of traditional idea of the African. But then on the other hand, we also see Africans in suits. So especially the guy taking the photograph on the right, in modern dresses. There's a woman standing next to him, and then the woman in the yellow dress in the background. We also have on her right is this figure, also an African in trousers and shirts, which is actually how China, a dress that's quite common in China. So you don't wear a complete suit because it's too hot. So you just wear a shirt and trousers. And we have also Africans who are, you know, the guy actually sitting on the tractor in this kind of flannel shirt, right? So more kind of working gear, right? So this is particularly interesting because it assembles these various types of clothing, which in other posters are often separated, as you may see later on. Yeah, and this is the one we'll come to the text later on. Let's move to the next one, which shows the Africans in military attire, which is also a pretty frequent one. And again, you can see that the African's not appearing alone, but there are other types accompanying him. And what's also interesting is the weaponry. So this is very mixed, right? Ranging from, you know, a submachine gun to a spear. And this is something that I actually learned at the workshop last year, because I was, you know, I was putting this down to, you know, these are all stereotypes. But indeed, some of those liberation movements, in particular in Congo, they really had this mix of weapons, you know, reaching from very traditional archaic weaponry to really kind of modern armament. So this is not entirely out of the blue. But then you have also images that show a more modern side, and also that foreground women. There are not too many of those, but some are there. So we have this woman here. Yeah, so basically calling on others to follow in their resistance to American imperialism. And then we have this one here, American imperialism, get out of Africa. And this is interesting because African women are distinguished from Chinese women in particular through one marker, and that's the earrings. So they're always depicted with jewelry, or with earrings are typically not other jewelry really. And Chinese women never do that, because it's not consistent with the stereotype of the Chinese woman at the time, which often is shown in more or less masculine dress and, you know, masculine haircut and so on. And then the other interesting thing is, of course, the woman on the right, the one, you know, who is both a revolutionary fighter and a mother as well, which is also, that is something that you can also see in other, you know, Chinese kind of visual arts contexts. And here again, we have this mixture of weaponry, which again shows that, you know, this is now early 1970s. So, you know, across different periods in China's political, ideological development, you can see this very mixed picture. But then, as I said before, this is not entirely devoid of reality. And if you look at, for example, this photo, this isn't a Chinese publication, and it shows the opening address by the president of Guinea, Sékou Touré, to the second Afro-Asian Solidarity Conference, and you see the exact mix of different dresses by African leaders that actually the Chinese visual propaganda picks up. So it's not entirely fanciful. It has a certain basis in reality, but it is still, of course, an act of stereotyping. Okay, let's look at my third thesis. Between the 1950s and early 1960s, Chinese propaganda posters featuring Africans shifted their focus from world peace to world revolution. However, they were probably rather slow in taking up the CCP's revolutionary approach. And since I still have some time, I want to basically relate this to the main kind of piece of literature that we have that looks really at Chinese-Soviet competition in Africa and Asia, which is Jeremy Friedman's book, Shadow Cold Wars. And he's making this point, and I think he sees this transition in China, you know, from towards a world revolutionary approach, I think in the mid to late 1950s. And I think the visual propaganda picks this up somewhat later than that. So if we look at this one, and in a way, the first image that I showed with the three men and the peace dove in the background, they're very similar, right? It's also quite remarkable that the color blue dominates a lot of these photographs. So I think, I don't know, it's the peace dove and blue, the UN symbol, you know, white and blue. I think it picks up a lot of that language. And it has the same kind of try that we've already seen, but this time they are females, and this is, I think, a very kind of very deep-reaching kind of Chinese cultural understanding of women, their mothers. That really is important. And again, this is something that goes back into the pre-revolutionary period, you know, all the way back into the 1920s. But the more relevant point for our discussion here is really that we have this strong focus on world peace. And compare this now, this is, so this one was 1960, that is relatively late. This is when the political shift has already taken place, and now we'll look at the same thing in 1965. And again, we have a number of different kind of ethnic types there. And here very clearly we have the dominating color red, and we have a shift towards revolutionary anti-imperialist struggle. And singling out here American imperialism. I'll come to that later on again. Okay, my fourth point is that Chinese propaganda posters rarely address the rivalry with the Soviet Union in connection with Africa or Africans directly. Instead, they generally choose a more indirect approach. But as you will see, and as I will demonstrate, the rivalry is there and it is being addressed, but often in more subtle ways. So we have already seen a couple of posters that actually explicitly address American imperialism as the main enemy. Now this one here, this is interesting in various ways. Again, we have here, interestingly, the European rather than the Latin American type. But we have here indeed now the attack on what is called Soviet revisionism. This happens from the posters that I've seen mostly in the late 1960s, which is not coincidental. That is the high period, the hot first period of the Cultural Revolution. It's also the time when I think Soviet-Chinese relationship reaches its lowest point. It's the time when, you know, they fight over Damansky Island in the Amur River. That's 1968. So all of this plays an important role there. I'm just mentioning in passing that all three are carrying the selected works of Mao Zedong. We will come to that later. But I do want to point out that the text above the globe there in the background, that is the first part of what I've translated there. It's proletarians of the whole world unite. And that is interesting in a number of ways, and partly, I think, contradicts Friedman's argument that what the Russians or the Soviet Union wanted was a class-based revolution in Africa, and what the Chinese wanted was a kind of anti-imperialist revolution, because the Chinese were quite conscious of, especially, of course, during the Cultural Revolution, which was, after all, a proletarian cultural revolution. So they paid a lot of attention, and in those posters where Africa is represented, this slogan occurs quite frequently. I have at least one where actually the phrase is extended to say, unite with the oppressed peoples across the world. Yeah, so where this international list and anti-imperialist dimension is a lot stronger than here. But even so, I mean, very clearly, and you may have seen this in other posters as well, these people are not just by the text, but also by wearing these kind of jumpsuits, right? So working men's clothes, industrial workers' clothes, marked out as members of the proletariat. Okay, then, and this is now a continuation of the previous, from the early 1960s, the PRC posited itself as a model for Africa in the realms of ideology and development. And this can now be seen, and this is I think, my main point here, seen as an indirect attack on the USSR. And in pursuing this line, PRC propaganda posters place Africans at the receiving end of Chinese support. Okay, and again, let me illustrate this with a number of pictures. And of course, let's look at ideology first. And again, here we have, this is now a variation. It does not say proletarians, it says people of the whole world unite. And it's an interesting one, and I have deliberately translated it as people, not peoples, because the term that's being used here, China has a word for people as a class and people as an ethnic group. And the word that's being used here is renmin, and renmin is people as a class. So you have in the People's Republic, you've got people who are renmin, and so who are people, and you have the category of fey renmin, non-people, which are, you know, the old oppressive classes, landowners, former capitalists, and so on. So this is an important point because it, again, kind of has a social dimension. And then, of course, you have, again, the juxtaposition, this is 1969, of American imperialism and Soviet revisionism in this kind of global anti-imperialist struggle. And then, of course, you have the towering figure of Mao, and you have his writings, which are often either presented together with him or as a surrogate of his likeness. Yeah, so these are either the Little Red Book. I can't read. I think it's the Little Red Book. I can't read it from here. Let me see. Yeah, I think so. I think that. Or I'm actually not sure. So it's either the Little Red Book, translated, of course, in many languages, or it's the selected works of Mao Zedong, and they are seen as they're basically seen as this kind of revolutionary blueprint for other parts of the world. And here is another one. So we have on the left-hand side, of course, you know, Chairman Mao as the savior, which is one of the attributes which are often used. And again, we have, interestingly, those Africans in military attire with this kind of mix of antiquated and modern weaponry, reading the selected works of Mao Zedong in an English translation. So there's a lot of, you know, attention to detail here. The even more interesting one, which again picks up this, you know, the African revolutionary fighter as, you know, both traditional and modern. Hovering above those two fighters is Mao Zedong. And here's a quote. And this is quite general in what it says. The point is the context in which this statement was made. It was made to a delegation from Congo Leopoldville, so what was becoming at the time Zaire, in 1964, and it is actually reprinted in the Little Red Book. It's part, and the translation I have here is actually the translation from the English version of the quotations from Chairman Mao. Yeah, the official title of the Little Red Book. So it's very clear that China is positioning itself here, the PRC, as, you know, the ideological guide in a way of African anti-imperialist liberation movements. And this now is a very, very different context. You can see that the style is very different, always kind of almost naive, kind of peasant-like style, which is a very different context. This is the mid-1960s, but it refers back to the people's communes, which were founded in 1958 and were a deliberate attempt at departing from the Soviet model in both industry and agriculture. Yeah, and so again, we have here the point that I think it's a double point in a way. In 1964, the presence of all these international guests, including again some Africans, shows that you know, in a way, kind of legitimizes the communes, which by the time they still existed, but the Great Leap Forward had basically been called off. And in the early 1960s, there had been experiments with decollectivizing agriculture. So this might be a political statement in that context. But on the other hand, of course, it also proposes the people's commune as an economic model, for a potential economic model for peoples across the world, including Africans. And this one is a particularly interesting one. And it is part of a small number that I've seen of posters that incorporate African visitors, yeah, I've circled them there, into larger vistas of cityscapes. And this is a particularly interesting one because it depicts the Yangtze River Bridge at Nanjing, which was built in the 1960s without Soviet assistance. It was the first major project built without Soviet assistance and also not using Soviet materials. So the concrete that was used was produced in China. And in fitting Africans into this context, and I think they're really the only non-Chinese group in there, again, China is positioning itself as an economic model that Africa can, or African countries can emulate. And, you know, again, this is actually one of the few projects that can be Well, I mean, I think there are some references, visual references to the Congo as well. But evidently, everything that refers to the Tanzam Railway, the railway that was built in the late 60s, early 70s from Tanzania to Zambia, is a relatively specific reference. Often the references are unspecific, as you've seen. But again, here, this in a way combines ideology and practical aid, because this the slogan that's printed there, "Serve the revolutionary people of the world," is an elaboration of a famous phrase from Mao, "Save the people." He used that for the first time in 1944 in a eulogy for a fallen comrade or a deceased comrade. But this is now really being broadened, so in including revolutionary in there and of the world. So this is internationalized and also becomes part of, in a way, the Chinese aid that's given, the Chinese assistance, including the labor export, is part of this revolutionary program. And then finally, we have seen this again, but now I want to show you the text as well. So revolutionary friendship as deep as the ocean, that's something to bear in mind for what I'm talking about next. But the one that's above there, those characters that are painted there on the wall, is independence and keeping the initiative, regeneration through one's own strength. That was an economic program that China, or an economic strategy cum ideology that China embarked on after the split with the Soviet Union. So this is again championed here, propagated as a model for African countries. This is what they can do in order to get on their feet. Okay, the sixth thesis, as well as positing the PRC as a model for Africa, and this is something, by the way, that this I think hasn't really been appreciated enough by the existing studies. Propaganda posters also attempt to emotionalize the relationship between Chinese and Africans by showing them in close physical proximity and or using a vocabulary of friendship and feelings. So that's really an important one. And this is an interesting one. This corresponds, it's 3 years earlier than the one that we have seen already, showing the People's Commune, but it's the same style. And this is really interesting because the quote is actually not communist at all. It's a quotation from the Analects of Confucius. But the broader setting in a way is the same, and it is using this phrase from Confucius for a rhetoric of friendship. By the way, the same phrase was used for the Beijing Olympics in 2008 as well, the very same phrase. But at the time there had been a Confucius Renaissance. In 1961 there was none, right? But it's still being used. Also, the handshake is important, and it's an interesting one. These are the documents, edited documents of the first and second Afro-Asian Solidarity Conferences, and you can see the second one, the later publication, the black hand is a lot more worked and a lot more profiled than the first one. But the handshake is an important one, or the interlocking arms. That is a very typical one. You've seen this actually already in many posters. I'm just addressing it now here. Then this one here, which again has some kind of physical proximity. We have here what is probably a so-called barefoot doctor, so a medical worker with no medical degree, but someone who can bring healthcare to remote rural communities in China, and a lot of these were also sent to Africa. And again, you look at the slogan, feelings of friendship, deep friendship, that's a typical kind of rhetoric. Or this one here, this is table tennis now, the silver ball conveys friendship. That's another way. And again, look at the African girl wears earrings, the Chinese girl does not. So all of this is out there. And then long live the great union of all people in the world. That's what you see there on the right, is that banner there on the right. Or you have something, that doesn't actually show people in close contact, but uses the rhetoric of friendship. Here, the Tanzam Railway is the road of friendship. And I've just through Interlibrary Loan, I got a collection of poems from workers, Chinese workers who built the railway, which is called the Rainbow of Friendship. And of course, I mean, if you want to know more about, the rhetoric of friendship in China, Anne-Marie Brady's work on managing foreigners shows very clearly that the rhetoric is there, but there's that all these relationships were very carefully managed. So one needs to place this in context. Okay, my seventh thesis, and I'm now coming gradually to the end. The visual rhetoric of African themed posters is transferred often from domestic context. So evidently, when we have different peoples from across the world, this can be seen as an extension of posters that show the multi-ethnic character of China itself, with its 56 national or 55 national minorities. And of course, again, we have Mao Zedong towering above the crowd. The interlocking arms can also be seen in this poster, which is really, against British colonialism in Hong Kong. The Barefoot Doctor is also portrayed in a variety of posters in a domestic context. However, in a slightly different, I think the message is slightly different, because what these posters suggest is generally that the Barefoot Doctor is learning from ordinary people. Whereas in Africa, it's different. In Africa, it is the Barefoot Doctor is caring for African people. Here, it's a really kind of learning context. It's all this guy who knows all the herbs that the Barefoot Doctor can use to cure the sick. I wanted to show one. Here's are the Barefoot Doctors. I wanted to show one where I knew this Chinese version for a long time. And then a student of mine to whom I assigned this for a primary source analysis discovered this version. And this is now an international version. So international versions of those posters existed, but I am completely convinced that the Chinese version was the earlier one. It's also suggested by the dates, which are not my dates. I didn't verify them. I basically adopted them from the website. Okay, and then the final one. After the death of Mao, Chinese propaganda posters depicting Africans reverted to the generalizing themes of the 1950s. And just two examples here. Again, the peace dove. Again, blue is the dominant color. And then we have a variation of the friendship theme of these foreigners visiting the Great Wall, including an African figure in the flowing attire. But this is, of course, the time, 1979 is the year that the first Western tourists traveled to China. But what we clearly have is that the revolutionary theme is now basically being put aside, and propaganda puts that behind it, and it's a lot more again about it's still about friendship, but it's much more about peace and about receiving international visitors and so on. And so I don't have a general conclusion here, but maybe we can move on to the discussion, and maybe I can say some or can add some more general points there. Thank you.